So now that everyone is, welcome to this webinar from the Young Urbanists Network, the Academy of Urbanism, based here in London. We have a very exciting international panel this morning in Paris, Sydney and Auckland, New Zealand. So this is, I think, the first webinar we're doing on the specific topic of micro-mobilities. So we're going to be touching on dockless bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters. Just before we start, I have to say that the webinar is recorded. You can remove your video if you don't feel comfortable being recorded. We have 3 speakers then with 3 presentations of around 10 minutes. And then we will have some time for questions. So I'm inviting you to submit your questions in the chat box. We will then select the relevant questions and invite you to ask the question directly to the speakers at the end. So without further ado, just to give a bit of context on why micromobilities are so important right now, it's such a hot topic. Obviously with COVID-19, we have to reinvent our streets and reallocate road space to active travel, and we believe that micromobilities have an immense role to play in modal shift away from private cars. In England, the Department for Transport has launched 2 consultations. I'm going to submit the links so you can have a look later. But one consultation is finishing on Tuesday, and it's about legalizing e-scooter rentals, and the other one is on the future of mobility, gathering evidence for micromobilities as well as mobility as a service. So really, really hot topic. I'll send the link right now anywhere in the chat room. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marion, joining us from Paris, who is going to touch on the key takeaways from the Paris experience regarding micromobilities. And then we'll have George from Auckland and Megan from Sydney, but reflecting on urban design in general. I'll hand over to you, Marion.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm Marion Lagadic. I work in a Paris-based social sciences research firm specialized in mobility and called 60. We have done quite a lot of research on shared mobility, and in June of 2018, when Lime launched its shared e-scooter service in Paris, we started a new research campaign on shared e-scooters as they became quickly very, very popular in Paris. So this research campaign covered several studies, 2 large-scale user surveys in partnership with e-scooters operators Lime and Dot, and analysis of e-scooters parking patterns, and an independent study on the regulation of these services. So what I'm going to be presented today is key takeaways from all these studies and what we learned from looking at the evolution of these services and their regulation since June of 2018. So for starters, how were these services welcomed in France? An important point is that it developed very quickly. The first service was launched in Paris in June 2018, and by May 2019, there were already 12 operators in Paris only, so thousands of e-scooters on the streets. It developed really, really quickly. And first, these e-scooters were deployed in a legal vacuum. The difference between France and the UK is that in France, anything that's not explicitly forbidden is allowed, while in the UK, anything that's not explicitly allowed is forbidden. So these e-scooters had no legal status, but they arrived on the streets in a massive wave. And first, users were using them on the sidewalk, which created a lot of user conflicts because some of these e-scooters could go as fast as 30 kilometers per hour. So this was quickly solved through regulation, and e-scooters were forbidden on the sidewalk. So that problem didn't last for too long. But the main problem was the fact that these e-scooter fleets were really massive. Each operator had thousands of e-scooters, and they were everywhere. There was a big street clutter problem, a lot of vandalism, e-scooters being destroyed and thrown in the River Seine, and parking management had not been planned beforehand. Discussions between operators and local authorities at the time had been quite light before services were launched. So that was the major issue that we faced. Another problem that led to a strong public outcry was that these services were relying on a precarious workforce, what Lime called the juicers, so precarious workers who were in charge of collecting scooters, charging them, and then redeploying them for very, very low salary and very limited protection. This, due to the public outcry, operators changed their way of dealing with these workers. So that's also something that was managed quite quickly. But the key issue that was raised by local authority was the fact that these services could represent a threat to the mobility ecosystem. They could be in competition with public services that are much more affordable and that the local authority has been offering for years, without providing a similar replacement, given that many operators went bankrupt after a couple of months. So it was hard for local authorities to decide to rely on these services to offer a service to their constituents. So in light of all these problems, the key discussion at the beginning was, are they worth regulating? Shouldn't they just be forbidden because they create too much trouble on the street? But they also have some key benefits that local authorities wanted to capture. First, these shared e-scooters operators provided a free, even though the local authority maintains the roads, etc., shared mobility service, an additional service to constituents, and they didn't want to deprive constituents of this option. Second, local authorities were really interested in the first mile, last mile aspect of this solution. And finally, they were very much interested in the potentials for modal shift inducement that these services could provide. So we conducted user surveys with several service operators, which allowed us to understand a bit how these services were used. In terms of user profiles, shared e-scooters in Paris were not really inclusive. 42% of users were actually tourists and not residents. Users were mostly young men in intellectual professions and with relatively high income. And users were not about daily uses, but more about occasional uses, as 42% of users only used shared e-scooters about 1 to 3 times a month. But an interesting aspect of these services was that about 1 in 4 shared e-scooter trip was an intermodal trip, linking mostly to metro stations. So that was a potential that the local authority was expecting to see, and that did manifest. In terms of impact, a lot of studies coming from the US suggested that shared e-scooters could provide a replacement for car trips. It was not the case in Paris. 44% of local users, so excluding tourists, would have walked without this service, and 33% would have used public transport. Only 3% would not have been able to travel, and only 4% would have used the car. So it's not really providing a modal shift from non-sustainable to sustainable solutions, but mostly capturing walking and public transport trips. However, the service became very popular very quickly. After only 1 year in service, we estimated that the modal share was between 1% and 2% for shared e-scooter services, while Paris's shared bike service, the public bike service Vélib', only reaches about 2% after years in service. So it became very popular. And the hypothesis that local authorities and ourselves were making is that maybe e-scooters were providing that little bit of fun that makes public transport more acceptable, as a lot of trips were actually intermodal. And the other potential that was still identified was that it could provide a new demand for cycling infrastructure. Suddenly there was a massive crowd of people in need of cycling infrastructure because they were no longer allowed on the sidewalk. And maybe that could raise awareness and allow the Paris City Hall to pursue its strategy of developing cycling lanes. So the regulation context now, how could these services be regulated for local authorities to make the most of them? We did a study on regulation that was based this time not only on Paris, but on the whole of France. And we conducted interviews with 20 local authorities and about 10 service operators. At the beginning, as I was mentioning, there was a bit of a legal vacuum, and a lot of local authorities actually thought that they were not able to regulate these services as they were brand new and there was no precedent. However, bigger local authorities who were better advised, had better legal counseling, found that they actually could use tools about occupying public space for profit regulate these services. So there was a big divide in France between those local authorities who felt that they couldn't do anything and those who were able to regulate them very quickly. To correct for that, a new law was passed in December of 2019 that allowed every local authority to regulate shared e-scooter services through licenses. However, an important point is that if the law allows local authorities to provide licenses, it doesn't make having a license mandatory for operators to launch a service. So that's a nuance that allows them, if they are willing to go to a legal conflict, to still launch the service without the local authority allowing it. Through the interviews we conducted with French local authorities, we found that the crux of the problem when it comes to regulating these services was actually data. Data sharing was a key point of debate in France, and the law actually plans for operators to share that data with local authorities. But through these interviews that were conducted before the law, we found that many local authorities were already collecting data, but they didn't have the means to actually analyze this data. They were not used to dealing with big data, especially middle and small cities. So we find that to be able to better regulate these services, they have to develop new competencies. Otherwise, there is not really a balance between operators who have legal counseling and data, and local authorities who do not know exactly how these services are used, by whom, and may have ill regulation because they do not know the specifics. And that's something we found for some local authorities in France. Those local authorities had decided not to forbid these services because they thought it could be interesting to have them on their territory. However, the rules that they chose were so drastic and so incompatible with the business models of these operators that operators could not launch the service. So for instance, by putting in place rules for incremental fleet development or fleet size limits, operators are not able to provide an efficient service with a fleet large enough for people to find the service to be reliable, and they prefer not to deploy the service rather than damaging their image. So that lack of communication was a big problem in many French cities. So we try to draw a good process the way it could work in the legal framework that has been provided now. First, a dialogue beforehand between local authorities and operators is key, and it didn't happen in many cases at the beginning of these services. We also found that many licenses were a bit too vague, and that to tailor the specific conditions sorted with the revocable license, it was necessary to better monitor beforehand. And finally, we found that dynamic data sharing, data analysis, and revision of regulatory measures was necessary because these services change so fast that regulations that were adopted at the beginning of their launch were soon no longer adapted to the way services were used, to fleet sizes, etc. So these services are so dynamic that local authorities who have a less dynamic process really need to adapt, not only for shared e-scooters, but also for future services that we may not even be thinking about now. So that was for a quick overview, and maybe we can discuss that later in the discussion.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Marion, for this really good introduction on the Paris context and the experience in terms of regulation, which we definitely need to learn from here in England. I'm now going to pass on to George Weeks, who is an urban designer at the Urban Design office in Auckland, and he's going to tell us a bit about the Auckland experience.
Good evening, everybody. I'm trying to share my slides. Let's see if it will work. Can you see a picture of a person on a scooter with a pink screen? Fantastic. Is it in full screen, or is it not? Is it full screen or not yet?
It's not full screen yet.
Not full screen yet. Okay. Is it now?
Now it is. Thank you.
Fantastic. Good morning, everybody, or good evening if you're on this side of the world. I'm going to talk about the urban design experience of Auckland in relation to micro-mobility. By way of background, I used to live in London, where I worked for Transport for London, and I spent a lot of time cycling, preferably leading young urbanists on cycling study tours. I've lived in New Zealand for 3 years, and so here's a quick geography lesson. The country is geographically a bit larger than the UK, but with a much smaller population of 5 million. About half the country lives in this very, very small top half of the Upper North Island, and about a third of the entire population lives in Auckland, including me. And New Zealand's a very, very urbanized environment, much more so than the UK. And Auckland, this is Auckland city centre in the frame, is known as the city of sails. I think it's got the highest rate of boat ownership in the world. It's also a city built on a landscape of about 50 volcanoes, giving it a beautiful landscape and also some pretty impressive hills, which are great fun on a bicycle. And while Auckland city centre is quite dense, most of the rest of the city is built to quite a low density. New Zealand as a whole has very high rates of car ownership, among the highest in the world. But what's really interesting is that this year, new car sales are set to be overtaken by e-bike and scooter imports. So just bear this graph in mind. This is very, very significant for what we do professionally. Talking of 2020, I need to mention COVID-19. New Zealand had its first case of COVID-19 in February this year. And following expert advice, New Zealand moved into a very strict lockdown for most of April and into May. And as of today, we have one COVID case in the entire country. And what was interesting about the COVID lockdown was it provided a real opportunity to see how different our streets could be. This is Ponsonby Road in inner city Auckland, which is normally really busy, 4 lanes of traffic plus car parking. This is how Ponsonby Road looked under lockdown. And I mean, what's interesting is people really appreciated this. Surveys by NZTA, the New Zealand Transport Agency, found that people really appreciated there being less traffic and more space during the lockdown. And this brings me on to micro-mobility in Auckland, the focus of this presentation. My position is that micro-mobility has a major role to play in making Auckland accessible to everyone if we design for it. And the pink path in this photograph used to be a motorway off-ramp before being converted into this wonderful path in about 2016. Now, I first became interested in micro-mobility as an adjunct to my interest in cycling infrastructure design, and more specifically, the realization that good cycle infrastructure can support a lot of different transport modes, even the little dog there, and provide access to the city for many different people. And the same goes for people with disabilities. If you're at all interested in disabled cycling, please visit the website of Wheels for Wellbeing on this slide. They're excellent. And this was all some research I was doing for a universal design conference. And during my research, I realized that many disabled people use micro-mobility devices to get around Auckland, like these electric folding scooters, or bigger scooters like the Zoomini or Segways. I mean, a Segway is not designed as a disability aid, but I know at least one person in Auckland who uses one. Also in New Zealand, we have a sit-down Segway for disabled people called an Omeo, which can come with off-road tyres, as in the left-hand slide, and which can do 20 kilometers an hour. And essentially, over the past 5 years, improvements in technology have made many more types of micro-mobility device possible. And these devices can enable many more people to get around and make the city more inclusive. And what's really interesting is how people find all kinds of ways to use micro-mobility tools and vehicles. To paraphrase Ed Harris playing the NASA flight director in Apollo 13, I don't care what micro-mobility is designed to do, I'm interested in what it can do. And I think the same applies to what we do professionally. So what can micro-mobility devices do in Auckland? They can cause controversy, that's what they can do, hooray. Journalism may be struggling professionally, but controversial pro or anti-scooter articles in Auckland press certainly generates lots of clicks. They're going to be the coolest thing that brings new access to our city. They're going to bankrupt the health service by causing accidents. They're ridden by eco-warriors, or are they ridden by louts? So much column inches on the pros and antis of e-scooters. And these quotes were all in relation to a series of trials of e-scooters by Auckland Council, with the scooters supplied by the Lime company. New Zealand's legislation was behind the curve, that they couldn't actually regulate them as vehicles, a bit like we heard in Paris. They had to use street trading licenses to control them. So really you could only control a scooter when it's parked. And how did people use them? People overwhelmingly use scooters for short trips of up to about 1.5 kilometers, which is shown on the graph on the left, and mainly for trips about 5 or 6 minutes long. Although interestingly, there's a bit of a tail of people using them for long trips of more than 20 minutes. And what's interesting is that the median distance of use of Lime scooter trips stayed much the same, but people were using them for slightly shorter trips. I mean, they can get quite expensive, so I think people were getting off at the traffic lights, finishing their scooter ride and then walking. When are they used? The main peaks of use are very, very similar to pedestrian peaks. They're heavily used during the week, particularly during the morning peak, as the red line shows. Where are they used? They're overwhelmingly used in the busiest parts of Auckland city centre. The red line shows the highest level of scooter use, and that vertical axis is Queen Street, which is the main street in Auckland city centre. It has the main shops, has the greatest job density. It also has the highest footfall, and it has the highest scooter use. Basically, if it's somewhere you want to walk, chances are it's somewhere you want to scoot. And this is reflected in the usage data. More than the green half of this pie chart, slightly more than half, shows the number of scooter trips that would have otherwise been walked. People like scooting because it's like walking, but a bit easier. For about a quarter of trips that would have been done by taxi or by car, they've been replaced by scooter trips. So they have some contribution to mode shift, but it's not significant. They are not an environmental panacea. Similarly, they don't last particularly long. The half-life of the scooter fleet in Auckland was about 90 days. And so there are concerns around durability and the amount of recycling of scooters required for this system long term. But like bicycles, scooters do make it much easier to get to public transport. This map here is a map of Auckland's urban rail system, and the little blue circles show the 800-meter walking radius from each railway station. And if we overlay this with a 3-kilometer radius, which reflects the kind of journey you can do by bicycle or by micro-mobility device, you suddenly get a much larger catchment. So micro-mobility is able to bring many more people within reach of trains and buses, and that is an interesting aspect of the micro-mobility revolution. Another aspect to think about is safety. I mean, I showed you the columns earlier. People are concerned about safety. The current records around micromobility in Auckland is that it is less safe than cycling, quite considerably less so, although this may be down to the newness of the technology and the condition of roads and streets. It's about as safe per minute as other things that New Zealanders like doing, like snowboarding or skiing or riding horses. And it's much safer than playing rugby. So that's where we are with our safety data so far. I mean, this is quite new technology. This is not a 3-year rolling average of safety data, and we're going to have more in a few years' time. I think that there's a major issue of safety for the people who aren't on the scooters, for pedestrians. People don't like sharing footways with scooter users. 72% said they do not like it. So almost 3/4 of people interviewed said, I don't like to walk when there's scooters around. So what this means is that we need better infrastructure. If this graph here shows on the left a road with a cycle path, and when that was the case, 86% of the scooter users were using the cycle path, and 12% were using the footpath. That's a typo in that slide, sorry. And when there wasn't a cycle path, scooter users tended to use the footpath. So basically people will scoot where they feel safe. And if they feel safe on the footway, they'll use it there. If there's a cycleway, chances are they'll use it. But this here is a wider point. And if there's anything that you do after this presentation, please go and watch Professor John Parkin's video on the separation of cyclists and pedestrians. This chart on the left shows on the left median walking speed. Then in the middle, you've got median speed by bicycle or scooter, and then you've got median car speed on the right in an urban area. And you'll see there's absolutely zero overlap between the average person walking and the average person cycling or scooting. So if you're wanting to design comfortable environments for walking and scooting, please, please, please provide separate spaces for each. Shared spaces really are not comfortable for large users. What's slightly ridiculous is that it actually is illegal to operate a scooter in a cycle lane in New Zealand currently. You wouldn't believe it, but it is. But the New Zealand Transport Agency is in a process of revising its regulations to catch up with how the world has changed since then. And this ties in very nicely with Auckland Transport's new guidance on accessible streets and junctions designs, as well as the Auckland City Centre master plan vision of access for everyone, which for Auckland City Centre envisages a pedestrian priority Queen Street at the heart of the city centre, surrounded by low traffic neighbourhoods, and micromobility is a key part of this. So to conclude, I just want to take us back to this diagram I showed you near the start, the fact that e-bike and scooter imports are likely to exceed new car sales in New Zealand later this year. This is not just a bit of a fad. This is something that is very, very significant. It's going to have huge consequences for how cities work. And as urban designers, planners, academics, surveyors, architects, professionals, all of us in this room, we really need to think about what this can mean for our cities and how we can really maximize the benefits thereof. And that's my 12 minutes. So thank you all for listening.
It's brilliant. Thank you so much, George. That was really fascinating. And also I really enjoyed the little lesson in geography. Always very good to put things in context. Now over to Megan. Megan, you're going to focus on the design for streets and also on the parking implications, I think, of micromobilities. Yeah. So over to you.
I actually had on George's safety point. So there's actually a lot of emerging evidence that these new e-scooter riders haven't used any form of active travel. There's some studies that have shown, and a couple coming out of the US, that 70+% of some of these groups have never even ridden a bike. They're not regular bike users. So I think when we think about safety, there's a large percentage of these e-scooter riders who actually never use other active travel modes, and what sort of safety and training implications there are from that. So with that, I'll share my screen. When I was thinking about what particular urban design, let's see if that's large. Yes. When I was thinking about what particular urban design, and because of COVID happening, there's a lot that's talking about pop-up lanes and, you know, providing more pavement space. But actually a key point that is missing for me, and a key point that I saw come up again and again and again, is parking for micromobility. And why do I say that? Because we have millions of car spaces, millions of car parks. And if we're going to make micromobility part of the future, we actually need to think really closely about parking and what does parking look like. In particular, as I'll talk about throughout this, there's a lot of groups that they do not have access to parking. They'd have to put their scooters, their bikes, their Segways inside of small flats or have unsecured parking. And so parking is a really important part of this puzzle. And why is that? Well, it's actually one of the #1 things around dockless bicycles, dockless e-scooters that we get complaints about. The rise of dockless bicycles, street litter or the future. Scooters are littering sidewalks, injuring pedestrians. Paris crackdowns on scooters, banning them from being parked on sidewalks. And a lot of that comes down to the fact we don't provide parking for them. So if we're not providing places for them to park, if we are not designating parking, then where do we expect them to go? They'll go where they think it's safe, which is on the pavement. And then that takes away space from the pedestrians. So what sort of parking do we need and how much of it do we need? Well, if we're talking about millions of new users, and especially in COVID, we're talking about in some of these cities, London and Paris, we're talking about a reduction of capacity of normal public transport down to anywhere from 10 to 20%. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of users that we want to enable some sort of micromobility. So there's a few different types of parking that we need, particularly around the urban design and how we can design for it, how we can advocate, everything from developers and to what I'll do on my last slide, some quick wins. So there's the short-term parking, which is basically less than 2 hours, thinking about, I'm going to stop at the grocery store. I need short-term parking. Then there's the medium-term parking, 2 to 12 hours, and you're looking at more of workplaces, things like that. And then you get the longer-term parking, which is greater than 12 hours. And then there's also charging stations. So in parking, we're not just talking about the simple racks. There's also a whole other electric charging that we need to do, because juicing is actually one of the highest carbon emissions for e-scooter companies. So we also need to think about, can we have different types of companies using the same type of charging? And can we have that be mobile? Does it need to be docked? And how do we ensure that different types of mobility can use those sort of charging? So some short to medium term parking examples. Well, public interchanges are the #1, and this goes from short to long term. This is really going to enable that first mile, last mile that George was mentioned in his slide. So railway stations, bus stops, light rail stations, airports. If we do not have parking at these transport interchanges, then multimodal journeys are that much more difficult. And really, when we're talking about micromobility, multimodal journeys and public transport integration is key to driving usage across the board and to making this accessible for all. Public buildings, so central government, local government, health facilities, really any sort of public building needs both short to medium term. And this means various type of access on the road that you'll see and elsewhere. Workplaces go into some of the end of trip facilities. So not only do they want the visitor parking on the outside, but inside they might want different types of end of trip facilities like lockers, showers, secured parking, and things like that. Education facilities. You see kids riding scooters and skateboards and bikes. I mean, I have a 6 and 8-year-old, and they ride their scooters everywhere. Like, they love it over their bike. They're really accessible. And I have to say, as a parent, it's actually really easy for me to hop on a scooter, drop them off, and then want to take the scooter further on to my public transport journey to get around. So we need to think about how and where they're going to do that. Shopping centers, parks, and leisures. For medium to long-term parking, this is really about private residence, things that you're going to stay longer. And this is where having the higher level of security, so needing either swipe cards, access, things like that. Weather protection is really important, and storage areas where you can have long-term storage for different types of mobility. And I'm going to go through examples. So typically, this is what we've started providing. As cycles have become more popular, we really are only doing a standard type of parking. The problem with this, as I'm going to show later, is that's only catering to a very small percentage of micromobility, which is the basic bicycle. So in the top left, this is a picture of my child's school. From this, because they had so many scooter users, we ended up replacing this with half scooter parking to make them slots because they were just getting piled up. The bottom left-hand picture is one of University of Westminster. Again, this one is secure, it's underground, and it is only swipe access to staff and students. The one in the middle is cycle hangers. These are really great for road replacement. And the one on the right-hand side is a bike hub. These have been rolled out in the many Holland schemes across London. I will have to say a problem has been with these is that there have only been 1 or 2 accessible, which means someone with an adaptable hand cycle, somebody with a cargo bike. And that's a huge problem when we limit it. Also with these, there's no scooter parking. There's no electric scooter parking. There's no Segway. There's very limited, only for bikes. This was in Berlin. You can see with Berlin, most of them, they're providing bicycle parking, and the scooters are using the bicycle parking. And when I was going around Berlin, I thought that was interesting, that anywhere you saw bike parking, the scooter users were happy to put their scooters there. So there is some research, if scooters see that bike parking is available, they will put their scooters there. The problem is, if you're not in a shared program, how do you lock them? And that can become difficulty. Now, I really like these. So these are a number, some random ones. Charge and Swift Mile are two of the more popular. And these are electric charging stations for the shared e-scooters. And you can see at this bottom left hand, they actually fit different types of scooters, which is really important. So you're not limiting the shared operators. Shared operators can use this. And what this enables is that governments can put in a shared docking station. So thinking about the UK trial, one of the gaps in it is where are all these going to park? How are they going to be juiced? But something like this, which can roll out into a parking space, will actually enable charging for multiple types of vehicles. Now, I will say that the downside of this, other than the top right hand, is that they're utilizing a maximum, a bit of pavement space. And what we really want to do is move them off of the pavement. So here are some skateboards in the top right, skateboard racks. Then if you look here in the bottom section, these are really nice because they allow both scooters and bicycles to be parked. And so you've got one type of rack that will allow both of them to be parked. Whereas in the top left, you can only put scooters, but this allows a private. So you need a mix of private and public, electric and non-electric. And then we need to think about other micromobility. At the moment, the conversation is mostly around bicycles and e-scooters, but there's heaps of other stuff. So in the right, you have people on rollerblades, you have people on Segbots, or in this top left, you've got a cycle that looks like a car. So where are you actually going to park these things? And the other part of that is adaptable hand cycles, as George mentioned, and there's a lot of electric. I mean, one of the things about micromobility, it is really opening up how accessibility can be played and how different users can create their own version of an accessible micromobility vehicle, whether that's a version of an e-scooter, whether that's a version of a bicycle. And at the moment, we're not catering to that parking. The bicycle racks can be really narrow, and it can be very difficult even for normal bicycles to get in there, much less someone that might have an adaptable hand cycle, much less needing, like cargo cycles or delivery drivers, or thinking about the first mile, last mile, or something like the tricycle, or in the bottom right, the advertising. So really a diversity of parking, and we need a diversity of parking, and we need to design for a diversity of parking. So what does that actually look like in terms of space? So basically in the UK, a minimum size, average size of car park is roughly 2.4 to 4.8 meters. Knot is a new company that is doing a standard electric charging for any sort of vehicle. You can fit 12, this is their size, 1.3 by 1.7. You could fit 4 electric charging stations, which is 12 vehicles. So they have models you could put up to 12 electric charging. Depending on the type of bicycle, you could get 6 to 20 bikes. So really, we're talking about an efficiency argument. You can get lots. 6 bicycles, you could put 6 cargo bikes. You could get up to 20, depending on how angled or what type of bikes. If you're doing without a charging station, roughly 1 meter squared for 12 scooters, you could get anywhere from 24 to 48 scooters. So what we're saying is, anytime we replace one car park, so thinking back to that first image, we can have heaps and heaps and heaps of micromobility and different types of micromobility. So if you moved 3 car spaces, you could have a charging station, you could have a scooter, a skateboard, something other, and then you could have bikes that allow a mixture of bicycles. So what would I do during COVID? What I've been realizing is we want everyone to cycle, but we're not providing parking, not in a single presentation that I've been a part of in the US, New Zealand, or the UK or Europe has mentioned increasing parking as part of COVID. So great, you're putting up all the pop-up lanes. What are we going to do? Where are we going to put them? Well, the easiest solution, the one that I think is convert parking, convert parking, convert parking. If we convert parking, we're sending the signal that they're welcome, we're providing the space. The number one area I would do is high streets, and I would put parklets everywhere and diversity of parking. Wide space racks, scooter racks, simple racks bolted into the ground, simplest. That would cost mid-range, couple thousand. Convert office parking. This one is actually really cheap because most of the buildings are secure and they don't have to be fixed in the ground. There's some leasing issues, so I've just done something with facilities management. But basically, if they want to change the parking, they can. It's already secure. They just say no cars here. They could rope it off with some cones and tape. That's it. Residential parking. Secure parking needed, especially in areas with historic transport inequality and small spaces like council's flat. If we don't provide residential parking, bikes will get nixed, scooters will get nixed. As someone who was living in a council flat in the middle of London for a long time, 30–40%, half my living room nearly, was made up of 4 bikes and a couple of scooters. Most people are not willing to give up half their living room to be bikes. And then the last bit is every design should have multiple types of parking. There is no one parking solution. We need secure, unsecure, and charging capabilities for both dock and dockless. So during COVID, we have to push to convert parking, or we will not succeed in terms of generating the micromobility push for the future we want. And that's me.
Amazing, and I do agree that parking is very, I mean, too often completely forgotten and absent from the debate on micromobility. So thanks for rebalancing that, Megan. There was one question from, I mean, we're just going to dive into the Q&A. So we've got one question from a member of the audience, so I'm going to hand over. But then if you have other questions, please drop them in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm sure speakers may want to ask each other some questions. So we have approximately 15 minutes for this. So I'm just going to give, I think Olga is going to have to help me with that because I'm not being very savvy. If we can unmute Charles Critchell so he can ask a question to, to Marion. I think you had a question for Marion.
Yeah, hi guys. Thanks. It was a really good presentation by everyone, really comprehensive overview. I just had a question for Marion, which was, how important do you think the role of micromobility is in Paris in achieving the mayor's aim of the 15-minute city?
Thank you very much, Charles. I think that's a very interesting question. There is no simple answer, I believe. The project, the 15-minute city project, is mostly focused on walking and cycling. It's the campaign project of the incumbent mayor who's running again and who has been focusing much of her action on developing cycling lanes. So the micromobility has not been at the core of the 15-minute city discourse these past months. However, the user surveys that we conducted in Paris showed that 55% of e-scooter trips are below 15 minutes and 69 below 20 minutes. So that's really how it fits. It's for short trips in the local area. There's also another use, same as George mentioned, for Auckland, of longer strolls, and those trips are mostly done by tourists by the River Seine. So if we keep that apart, micromobility really very much fits into the 15-minute city project. But I think one of the reasons why it may have not been discussed so much related to cycling is because the Paris City Hall is working now on selecting micromobility operators to limit the number of operators and the fleet in Paris. So this is still work in progress. And once this is settled, maybe they can work with the operators, but they want to settle who they will be working with and under which conditions before. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
I think from an urban design point of view, the micromobility is such a huge part of 15-minute neighborhoods or 20-minute neighborhoods in Australia and New Zealand. because it's about the small. So we tend to think of electric scooter, but really micromobility is about efficiency of space and maximizing active travel. And both of those things are really important for the 15-minute low traffic neighborhood, livable neighborhoods, and connectivity, and public strategic integration of transport across the whole network. So I think they're really important, whether you skip, scoot, skate, cycle, and accessibility, having the smallness of the vehicle is really key in terms of efficiency, because we have the road space, we just need to prioritize it.
We have a question from Andrew. Sorry, Olga, I'm going to need your assistance here again to unmute him so he can ask the question. Then we take a question from Jaffa.
Do you want me to read Andrew's question out?
Yeah, maybe we can just do that, maybe a bit quicker.
It says charging stations are very expensive to install and result in many logistical issues, such as who pays for the electricity. Do you think it could be more efficient for e-mobility operators to charge their devices off-site or to do battery swap outs? For the first bit about recharge their devices off-site, no. The data that I've seen is that it's creating additional congestion with juicing. There's also some third-party implications about who they're getting to juice. I think moving to the charge facility is better, and there's different mechanisms. So for example, if a council installed a charge operator, then those shared companies can basically tap into that by paying a monthly fee. So I think that there's business mechanisms in there that don't necessarily have to be expensive to install. There's a couple of trials. It's at a university in West London, and they have an electric charging station for bicycles. And actually they found that they were able to tap it into their grid because the battery capacity is getting a lot lower, which means that they're not having to increase the load versus like an EV station or fast charging. So they don't necessarily need to be very expensive to install. The machine itself, some of them can now be bolted on top of the existing electric infrastructure. So I think we're seeing that that's rapidly becoming the cheapest way. As far as battery swap outs, that one is purely a mechanism of employee time. And I think that could be better, but again, that goes back to the juicing. Are people traveling around in a van? Because at the moment, most of the operators use white vans, so then they're contributing to congestion. They're not actually doing that sustainably. So I think fixing the install for the charging station, working on that problem, there'd actually be some good solutions long-term that we could tap into and then start to address microgrids and things like that without having to be very expensive. But this means lower power output and not necessarily, going to the big vehicle, like really small micromobility.
Great. I'm just going to read 2 extra questions and open it to the panel. So we had one question from Andrew saying, fascinating stuff from all 3. Are there legislated speed restriction? And if so, is it internationally consistent, appropriate, likely to change? And then we have another question from Jaffa. How have you convinced your Paris, Auckland or other city councils to actually adopt micromobility? Is this driven by private corporate like Lime or by councils themselves? It's a little chicken and egg. With no infrastructure, there's no demand, and no demand, no infrastructure, and so on. I think Marion touched on that as well. Yeah, just open it up on these 2 last questions before we close.
Right, I'll answer the 2 of them quickly from the Auckland perspective. So good questions, both of them. Are there legislated speed restrictions? In New Zealand, there are power restrictions. I think the maximum is 300 watts. So that will have an effect on speed. The design of the vehicles, I mean, I know certainly a Lime will not power itself above 25 kilometers an hour. And then in Auckland, they've used geofencing so that in certain areas, a vehicle will not do more than 15 kilometers an hour. And these have been worked out between the operators and the council legislators. I think the way it worked in Auckland was that Lime approached Auckland Council and Auckland Transport and said, hi, we'd like to try our scooters here. Can we work out some kind of a deal? And they did. So it was the initiative of the company, and in order to operate, they needed to get buy-in from the council, and then this was able to inform the subsequent experiment and of how do people use them. And so it was yeah, quite cooperative, really. Somebody else can fill in more details if they want to.
So I did a review. There's a report coming out from LCC, London Cycling Campaign, next week, where I looked at this, as well as I was on the expert panels for the Department for Transport and some sort of stakeholder workshops I did in the fall. For shared operators, for public operators, it's largely between 12 to 20, though the 20 miles an hour is slowly getting reduced for those who had been put forward in terms of legislation. In the US, it varies a lot. In the US, if you're on a private electric scooter, there is no legislation as to how fast you can go, as well as in Europe. So if you're on a private electric scooter, then you could go as fast as you want, as long as you're maintaining the road speed limit. Now, with shared operators, generally in Europe, and what they're proposing in the UK is between 12 and 15 miles per hour.
Maybe to add the French perspective on this, first there was no speed limit for e-scooters, and then it was lowered to 25 kilometers per hour, while many e-scooters, private e-scooters that had been bought by people, went above that speed. So there was a period of conflict between those e-scooters that people had bought before that were going much faster, and the new models that were capped at 25 kilometers per hour. And there's also another restriction that when an e-scooter is used in a pedestrian area, it cannot go over 6 kilometers per hour, so walking speed. But some shared e-scooter operators said that at that speed limit, they cannot ensure that the vehicle is stable, and that below 8 kilometers per hour, vehicles are not too stable. So that was another problem of local authorities and operators not really entering into a productive dialogue, and rules not really matching technical constraints. So that leads me to the second question about how the process happened in Paris about micromobility arriving in the city. I think the first step that I didn't mention in my presentation was dockless bicycles, and those arrived without any discussion between operators and local authorities, very massively, with massive fleets, and local authorities were very wary and taking bicycles off, and in a bit of an emergency situation. So when the e-scooters arrived, the process was much more concerted, but as the legal context was also changing with the new mobility law being discussed and not adopted yet, each local authority kind of did it differently. The Paris City Hall it has a good legal capacity, is able to regulate, so they discuss with operators and impose some restrictions, and they are dynamically revising them regularly. But the initiative was mostly private operators, even though some secondary cities who may not have the financial means to offer public shared bicycles, for instance, are now looking at ways of attracting these operators to still offer an alternative mobility, bicycles or e-scooters. Both are looked into.
Yeah, I mean, the amount of venture capitalist money that's in the electric mobilities, we're talking billions and billions that has been pumped into them. So it has definitely been private driven. The UK is a bit different because we had a very specific legislation related to carriages that basically made them illegal, which is why you haven't seen them proliferate, because we actually had a legislation anywhere where there's been wiggle room, where they could just jump into the market, and it's at least a 500,000 person city. They've done that, similar to what Uber's done. As far as, are there any examples of charging stations using solar? I'm aware of a few companies that are buying 100% renewables. I am aware of some bike charging that uses solar. I am not aware of any e-scooters that uses solar. some of the charge and not stations have started developing that. The problem is it adds significantly to the cost and they can't guarantee it. So then they usually are tapping into infrastructure anyway. So I see that as probably being a ways off in terms of solar capacity, but they're definitely buying renewable energy. A lot of them have key sustainability commitments, and a number of them are purchasing renewable energy for their juicing or for offsetting.
Right, it's almost 10 o'clock, so unless we have a concluding remark from our panel, I'm going to close the discussion, unless you have one last point you want to make. But I thought it was really great, and we had so many examples from all over the world and very inspiring, and always great to have a mix of political and legislative context, as well as the urban design and the proper urban planning bit that we like mixing with the wider context. So yeah, I'm going to thank everyone for attending this session, and to all our members of the members of our panel. And if you have any question, or you want to carry on the discussion, or even access the presentation, reach out to us either on Twitter or by email. You have our contact details anyway on the Eventbrite, or otherwise on the Academy of Urbanism's website. You can also find our contact details really easily. So yeah, I'm gonna just close, and thank you again, Marion, Megan, and George. It was brilliant.
Yes,
Have a good evening and have a good day for those who are on the northern hemisphere. Well, northern hemisphere doesn't make a change anyway, but those who are east, you got me. Anyway,
different time zone, yes.
Different time zones.
Yeah. Thank you
all
all.
right. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day, great evening.